Coming this Halloween from SJS Direct, a darker shade of black, Spellbound. Get Spellbound, paperback or ebook at your favorite online bookseller this Halloween. A lot of comic fans probably wonder why they cannot buy a comic book at a newsstand, a supermarket, a drugstore, or any sort of convenience store. And the main reason why you cannot buy a comic book at a newsstand, a supermarket, a drugstore, or a convenience store has to do with distribution. And when it comes down to distribution, it works like this. Retailers want something called returnability for products that are put in their store. That means if this product does not sell after a certain period of time, they can return it in exchange for store credit on next month's products. And in publishing, it works like this. Whenever a publisher releases a publication, they have a shelf life on them. And within 90 to 180 days, what the publisher can do, in most cases when it comes on the books, and usually 30 days when it comes on the magazines, is that they can take the unsold copies, tear the cover off of them, and then return those covers in saying these issues were unsold, and then get store credit for all of those publications that did not sell, and then use that credit to then as a buy the next month's issues. So they can credit that towards the next month's issues, and that primarily is returnability in a nutshell. And without returnability, retailers have no incentive to stock any sort of publications on their shelves, because without returnability, what happens is these retailers wind up stuck with this merchandise. And as this merchandise stays on the shelf for long periods of time, it gets damaged and it becomes shrink, and then they have to mark it down. And then in many cases, they have to take a loss on that merchandise. So in retail, where like supermarkets, drugstores, and newsstands, there's a very razor thin profit margin. And any item that does not sell, again, they take a loss on. And if they're going to take a loss on a comic book from day one, they have no incentive to stock it. This is the primary reason why we do not see comic books on the shelves of these retailers. And publishers in the comic book business pretty much wanted it this way because they wanted to make their money off the top. Now, back in the 1990s, Marvel at the time had bought Heroes World to have their own distributor. And unfortunately, that was one of the reasons why Marvel Comics went bankrupt back in the 1990s. And since then, many distributors went out of business. And now we only have one distributor of comics in America, and that distributor is called Diamond. And Diamond primarily does the distribution of all comics in the United States. And because Diamond is the only distributor and they do not offer returnability, the only place you can buy a comic book these days is at a comic book store, because comic shop owners buy into this publishing deal where they order a certain set of comics and they pay for them up front, and after they pay for them, they are stuck with them. And that means if anything doesn't sell, they pretty much have to eat the losses on those comics. Now, some comic stores actually like this, because what happens is if they get stuck with extra inventory and the comic book value goes up, then they're going to make a profit. Unfortunately, thanks to the world of reboots and retcons, many comic shops are now stuck with large stocks of comics that no one is going to buy, because no one's going to buy an old series that has been rebooted because it has no historical connection to previous series. So no one wants to sit there and read through these old issues, especially when there are things out here like trade paperbacks, which can give them the same comics for a cheaper price. And those trade paperbacks are sold in places like Amazon, and you can get a nice little discount on them. However, when it comes down to this distribution issue, it is one of the major issues that is impeding the growth of the comic book industry, because when it comes down to publishing, if you do not offer returnability, again, retailers have no incentive in stocking you. And if they do not stock you on their shelves, then customers can't find you. Because when it comes down to product, if the product is not on the shelf, then not that many people are going to know that that product exists. And when it comes down to products that people don't know about, they're not going to go and buy them. So it's hard to market comic book characters to new readers because new readers just don't know that they exist. The only place they ever hear about these characters these days is on a TV show like a Young Justice or a live action show like an Arrow or a Flash or Supergirl. They have no historical context or any connection to this character in their comic book form because there are no comic books being sold in their neighborhoods at neighborhood retailers because comic book publishers are still following a business model that is detrimental to them. Because when you look at this model, it again is impeding the growth of the comic book industry because you're not selling comics to casual customers, you're selling comics to comic fans because primarily who is going to the comic book store these days? Comic fans, because after the speculator boom ended, all the speculators and casuals pretty much stopped buying comics, and the only people buying comics right now are comic fans, and publishers are publishing comics for comic fans. And I believe one of the main reasons why people are afraid to walk away from Diamond and enter into other distribution models is because there's a lot of fear of having to deal with constructive criticism of the content in comic books. Because when it comes down to a lot of today's comics, if you were to give them to a casual reader, they would probably be, in many cases, offended by a lot of the content. And a lot of these guys would not, a lot of people would not come out here and buy comics on the regular. And when I look at comics today and all the gore and much of the violence that I've seen in many comics, I don't think it would fly too well with families and children. And that would be a big problem in selling them today to your modern day comic fans who have come out of movies like Captain America Civil War or any of these other Marvel Studios movies. They come out and then they read the comic and they would get offended. And a lot of these publishers know that when you have distribution like this and there's returnability and customers aren't buying things, that what's going to happen is you're going to get a lot of that unsold merchandise sent back to you, and you're going to have to take a big loss. But as I see it, distribution outside to outside retailers is a positive thing because, one, you're getting an objective assessment of what is really selling, because when you sell to a comic shop, you can say something like, oh, Black Panther #1 had 300,000 issues sold to comic stores, but we don't have an actual gauge of how many comics were actually sold to customers. Now, when you have outside retailers like supermarkets, convenience stores, drugstores, and newsstands involved, we get an honest assessment of how these comics are selling to readers in the general public. Because when you're getting those returns, you're seeing how many comics are being actually sold and in the hands of readers. Because that's when I used to look in the old comics back in the day. They used to have this section which told you how many comics were printed and how many were sold and how many were destroyed. And usually they would print about 500,000 back in the 1980s before the speculator boom. And what would happen is the book that was selling about 250,000, they would sell about 250,000 a month, and then the rest that didn't get sold, some were destroyed, some were damaged, other ones were donated and written off for a tax loss. And that's how we got our fair and honest assessment of how a comic was selling. Because when you have a captive audience like comic shops buying the product, you really don't have a fair and balanced assessment of how this title is selling in proportion to other titles. When you get those returns, you get an honest assessment of how a title is selling in proportion to other titles when it comes down to print. In ebooks, it's probably pretty much the same thing in some ways, but you're still getting that assessment of what is selling, what the customer is buying, what characters are popular, and then you can set a course for what direction you want to take the publishing catalog in and creating titles that will sell long term to new readers. But when you look at today's distribution model, again, it's preventing the industry from growing because, again, you as a publisher are not getting that fair and balanced assessment of how these books are doing in proportion to other books. When you look at the books in your catalog, you can see, this book here, Captain America, is selling 300,000 copies this month, and this Spider-Man book is doing maybe 220 5,000, then you can start saying, oh, well, maybe this book is having some issues. You can take a look at the storyline. You can take a look at the creative team, and you can set a course for where you want to go with it. But when you have comic shops ordering and then they're just sitting on inventory, you really can't get that assessment of how this character is doing, how readers like this character, how this book is being perceived by the public, and a fair and balanced picture of how this book is performing. And in trade publishing, when you're getting those returns, and you get like if I send 10 books to Barnes & Noble and maybe 2 come back, that's a good sign. But if I send 10 books to Barnes & Noble and all 10 come back, my plan would be to discontinue that title. And that's how it would work in trade publishing. But in comics, again, the owner buys all the comics, and the onus is on the owner to sell them all in any way he can. And he can either get full price if the book sells out, or he's going to be stuck with a whole bunch of stuff in the quarter bin that he has to take a loss on later on. And as I look at it, we really need to focus on distribution, because Diamond, as I see it, can't be the only distributor, because you're not getting that balanced picture of what comics are doing and how characters are selling, or even a way to set a course for what you want to do in publishing 5 years from now or 10 years from now, because the publications just don't have a gauge that is honest and fair in showing us the performance of titles in the catalog, and in a way that a publisher can set a course for their whole overall business and their overall business model. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.